You're listening to the Backlog podcast with host Kevin Lane and Joel Rubel, bringing you weekly discussions on gaming, as well as sports, entertainment, and anything else that they can think of.
Something wrong with me, man.
You got that right.
Be sure to check us out online at thebacklogpod.com, where you can listen to the podcast and get links to Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook.
A little bit of something, something.
I'm Joe.
I'm Kevin.
And we are
The Backlog Podcast.
Yeah!
Now, gear up and get ready, because we're about to check another one off of the Backlog.
Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition episode of the Backlog Podcast. I am your host, Kevin, and today is a recap and overall discussion about the series Game of Thrones. One of the key things that I think, when we talk about the video games and we talk about all the stuff that we normally talk about, Joe and I, on the Backlog Podcast, things like Game of Thrones is a significant factor in creating a backlog. If you're an everyday gamer and you need to catch up on your backlog of video, TV shows and movies and stuff, this one seems to be the biggest impact across the world for people's backlogs. So for me, I haven't watched a TV show religiously since the last season of Game of Thrones. And now it's here, and I've done nothing but open up the web browser and do research and all sorts of things, generating a longer backlog because games are still coming out. And I felt it was necessary to talk about this season throughout the last couple of episodes because of how impactful it's been across the world and in my life and in some friends' lives. But also, it's super interesting. The story itself, if you're not familiar, which I imagine you are, is it's a very large series of books by George R.R. Martin, and it deals with a mystical, magical world called Westeros, and it's got dragons, it's got some hints of magic, but nothing, it's not like wizards walking around shooting fire from their hands, and it's more about the politics behind a world like that. It's got tones of Tolkien and some other fantasy writers, but really, this guy has built a world with such description and such amazing character development throughout the different books that you read. Its adaptation from HBO has just been groundbreaking. So last night was the last episode ever. People have been waiting many, many years to find out what happens, and now we know. I'm going to do a quick rundown, then I'm going to do an introduction of our two guests today. And then we're going to just jump right into the discussion. It's going to be a roundtable. There is really no specific outline as to what we have to talk about because there's 5 books out. There's 7 total that are going to be completed, hopefully. And there were 8 seasons of TV shows. So we got plenty to talk about. We're allowed to dip back into the past or bring up a combination of stories that are relevant to today or, all that sort of thing. So without further ado, let me just do a quick rundown of the recap of the finale because it was pretty significant. A lot of key things happen. So we lead up to, in the past episodes, we had the conversion of Daenerys Targaryen turned into a Mad Queen, which was kind of hinted throughout the series, but really came into fruition in the last 2 episodes. She had demolished King's Landing, killed lots of innocent civilians, and now Jon and Tyrion are trying to figure out what the repercussions of that really are. They're walking through the rubble. They're seeing the impact to King's Landing, seeing dead bodies, seeing dead children, and they're getting very, very upset. As Jon's walking around, trying to figure out what's going on, he sees Grey Worm. Grey Worm was one of the most loyal and, in my opinion, one of the most honorable men in the entire chain of events that have happened with Daenerys Targaryen since she found him. And he basically is the leader of the Unsullied army, and now he's just walking around slitting throats of unarmed men. He's lost his love, and that has turned him into the opposite of what I saw him literally 2 episodes ago. And he's just standing there staring down Jon Snow, slitting throats, and suddenly learns teleportation. Because as Jon is walking around with Davos, he says to, let's go talk to the queen. And Jon continues on. As they walk up the steps and they confront Dany, Grey Worm is standing at the top of the damn steps. It's just amazing. And so now Jon has to take this long walk, get up there, and confront Dany, or stand by her side while she addresses her now quadrupled army of the Unsullied and Dothraki. She promotes Grey Worm to Master of War, or commander of all her armies, and Master of Teleportation. And Tyrion dejects Dany's choice, Dany's choice of murdering everybody and killing his brother and sister in the process. He makes a bold statement, tosses his handpin down, and gets captured and taken prisoner immediately. He basically knows he's about to die, but it's the choice he's making. He's making a stand. Arya, she's not going to be shown up by Grey Worm's new teleportation abilities, and she wants to remind everybody that she is also the master of teleportation. So while, this entire army on a flat playing field with no cover is there in front of Daenerys turns to walk away. Jon's looking at her, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And then Arya is literally just standing at his shoulder. Really, really cool cinematic there. And that kind of threw me off a bit. That was one of the these two moments with the teleportation. Obviously, it's an editing and continuity error, but for a finale like this, you would think, come on, that's just a little bit of an opinion going on. But so now we move forward. Tyrion and Jon, Jon approaches Tyrion in jail and is talking to him about what's going on. And Tyrion's obviously reasoning with him, tells him, you got to do what's right. Jon basically says, yeah, sorry it came to this. And Tyrion's like, what about your sisters? Like, she's going to kill him. You have to make a decision right now. So Jon literally immediately goes and kills Dany. I mean, it was like, boom, next scene, Jon shows up, basically talks to Dany, stabs her. And if you're a book reader, they talk about the Azor Ahai prophecy. I think this is their, this kind of confirms or fulfills that prophecy. And obviously there's some hints of maybe it really doesn't or maybe it really does, but I think that's just their way of satisfying that prophecy. And Jon, it cuts from there after Jon kills, and Drogon almost kills Jon, decides to kill the throne instead, showing his intelligence. In the books, I think they talk a little bit about the dragons being intelligent or overly intelligent. So it's basically Drogon saying, I know what happened here, and it's the politics that ruined everything. I mean, we're left to interpretation in this moment, but it was pretty clear. Drogon was pissed, Drogon was upset, but Drogon knew, I'm not going to kill Jon, and took Dany's body away, and Dany is gone forever in the Game of Thrones. She lost. She never got to sit on that chair. We cut to Tyrion. Tyrion's now, laying there in a jail cell. It took me a minute to realize it's weeks or months later, and he gets brought to the dragon pits with handcuffs on. And in front of him are the lords and ladies of all the major houses of the Seven Kingdoms. We got Robert Arryn, who now looks like Brad Pitt, and definitely grew up quite a bit. And we got Edmure Tully, who, if you remember, it was his wedding. That was the Red Wedding that everyone remembered so long ago. And we last saw him making a deal with Jaime Lannister, surrendering Riverrun. So it kind of surprised me to see that he's up there, on this panel, but he is. And Tyrion starts to speak. He wants to address the situation, but Grey Worm, who is in complete control right now, mind you, Grey Worm is running King's Landing. He's in complete control. He's got all the Dothraki and all of the Unsullied at his disposal, and he tells Tyrion to stop talking. However, Tyrion decides, I'm not going to stop talking. He proceeds to give an epic speech, which then changes the course of the Seven Kingdoms forever. Grey Worm loses complete control at this moment. How? I guess Sansa's little comment about they got King's Landing surrounded makes sense, but at the same time, he came in here saying, I have Jon Snow and we're not going to give him to you, and then just surrenders like complete control immediately. Sam suggests democracy because they're trying to figure out who's going to be the king or queen, and everyone laughs at Sam, but then immediately chooses democracy as what's going to happen in the Seven Kingdoms. So Sam says F you, sneaks a bottle of water on set, and that's kind of the last of that little part. Tyrion nominates Bran as king, and he skips right over Gendry, or Gendry, however you want to pronounce it, who, might think he has a claim to the throne. A couple of them up there. Edmure Tully gets up, speaks a little bit, but Sansa tells him to sit down. And that's it. Bran is nominated as the potential king. And then from my perspective, wargs into everyone's minds and forces them all to give a unanimous yes vote. So now Bran has been elected as the next king, and Tyrion continues with a new nickname and a new moniker for Bran, dissing him all the way to the bitter end, saying, Bran the Broken. Bran doesn't really seem to want it, but makes a nice little comment about, this is why he came all this way. So a quite interesting little note there, in my opinion, and something I really want to talk about with the panel here. Mira is seen in the distance just throwing her arms up like, what the fuck is going on? And so then we cut to, let's see here. We cut to Sansa. Now, removing the North from the Seven Kingdoms. She says she loves her brother. She understands he's going to be a good ruler, but the North will not, they're going to basically rule themselves. Cut to Yara being like, wait, what? Like, we could do that? And so, but she knew not to speak anymore because Arya is about to slit her throat. So a lot of good things going on in this little thing. But for a single moment, right, you realize that it's not Sansa. It's actually Littlefinger, who also learned the faceless man technique. And so Littlefinger is actually Sansa here. This is what I saw. Lastly, here we see Arya basically saying that she's the toughest bitch in town. And like I said, she's going to slit Yara's throat if she talks bad about Jon. Grey Worm takes his Unsullied to Noth. They talked a little bit with Missandei about protecting, or that the Noth people didn't really have anyone to protect them. So you could take this one of two ways. Either Grey Worm slitting throats is going there to take over Noth, or protect them. We'll see. I mean, in the next season, it's going to be really great to find out. But regardless, from the books, I understand that Noth is not a good place to go. From what I believe, the Noth survive on that island unprotected because there's poisonous butterflies that only the natives are immune to. So Grey Worm and his army go to Noth, and Grey Worm, who is a worm, dies because of these butterflies, but he's buried in a cocoon, and he becomes the King Noth, or the Noth King, and he turns into a giant humanoid butterfly, resurrecting the entire army of all the dead Dothraki and those Sullied. And they're all basically half-human cockroach spiders. So season 9 is gearing up to be something pretty special. Jon is sent north of the Wall because Grey Worm didn't like him, didn't like what he did to Dany. And so now that Grey Worm's gone, Jon is he's a committed man. He knows what he did. And he says, I'm going to follow the law. I'm going to serve out my sentence. So he goes north, right? He finally gets to see Ghost again, which, the entire internet was flipping out that he didn't say goodbye. Gives Ghost his little pets, and then goes from the most honorable man to saying, fuck you, I'm out. And he walks right through that wall. And from what it looked like to me, skips over the Night's Watch, and he's now a wildling. I thought that was actually a pretty cool ending. We'll talk about that. And in that process, we see a little bit of speck of grass. Looks like the North is starting to warm up a little bit. The long night is over. Jon didn't want to really rule anything or anyone, so this seems to be an ending that he would have preferred, and he gets to hang out with Tormund, which seems like a fun time. We cut back, and at the end here, we wrap up. It felt like forever at this point, because I just, I don't know, I didn't want it to end, but at the same time, it just felt like there were more scenes than there should have been. So we cut back, we see Brienne finishing Jaime's story in the book of all the Kingsguard, which I thought that was a pretty cool moment. Tyrion is prepping the table for the Small Council, and then we learn who the Small Council is, and another open discussion topic here, but the Lord Bronn of Highgarden, Master of Coin, Samwell Tarly, Archmaester, Brienne of Tarth, head of the Kingsguard, with Podrick Payne, who is now Sir Podrick Payne of the Kingsguard. Davos Seaworth is the Master of Ships. Obviously, Tyrion Lannister is Hand of the King, and Brandon the Broken, King of the Six Kingdoms. That's how we wrap up the show. A few seats are missing at the table. Bran comments about how there's no Master of Whisperers, or Master of War, or Master of Law. And people are probably wondering why he needs Master of Whisperers, considering he is King Whisperer. But at the very end, Bran suggests he's going to warg into Drogon. That would have been a really cool ending if maybe he did that while Drogon was killing everything in King's Landing. But it leads you to think, maybe King Bran did all of this on purpose. Maybe King Bran laid out this plan, and he's the ultimate villain at the end of the show. We don't really know because the show doesn't dive any deeper. We can end with a semi-happy ending, and a lot of the stuff I just said was a little bit in jest and not really true. If you watch the show, you know it. I just wanted to lighten the mood a little bit as we dive in. Sorry for the extra long intro. With us today, we have my brother-in-law, Frank Seitz. Frank, thank you very much for being here. How you feeling?
Kevin, I'm feeling good, Kevin. I appreciate the invite. I love talking Game of Thrones, so this is definitely looking forward to diving into some of the material you've already presented. It's definitely, there's a lot of open answers out there, stuff that's going to be talked about for years and years, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is true. So how did you feel towards the end here?
So, I have friends and family members who, especially in this season, especially in the last 3 or 4 episodes, they just constantly found issues with it. And I get that, especially as a book reader who's, I kind of gave up on fantasy after the Lord of the Rings movie and after Harry Potter was over. I'm like, look, I'm done with that stuff. And then it was actually Dan, my son, who he watched the first season of Game of Thrones, and he's like, you have to watch this show. And look, man, I'm done with that. I don't need any more swords. I don't need any more sorcery. And me and my wife, we binge watched it. And after that, I was like, well, now knowing there are 5 books, so I read the 5 books immediately after finishing the first season. And, I think what I said, I was disappointed when Dan and Dave said that they were going to do an abbreviated couple of seasons. Now it's acceptance. I've accepted that these episodes are an adaptation based on material that hasn't been produced yet, and I've made my peace with it. So what they've produced, I'm fine with. Is it the way I would want the material presented? Probably not, but I'm going to accept it as is because that's the way they've presented it. And then, my wish is we get a Winds of Winter soon.
Yeah. There's 2 points there that I want to dive into after we let Jerry speak, but the 2 points are the Winds of Winters being soon, which there's reason to believe it might be, and the other point of acceptance. And don't let me forget about either one of those 2 points, but before we do, Jerry, how you doing? Jerry Beharry, he's a past guest returning with us. He's talked football, he's talked video games, and now he's here to talk Game of Thrones. Always a pleasure to have you, Jerry. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it, Kevin. And just to kind of put it out there as far as my fan status is concerned, I want to take my comments with a grain. I actually was not one of the day one diehards, and I've never read the books, right? So the perspective that you get from me is someone who actually heard some of the mumblings about this Game of Thrones thing, probably a little into season 4. And then I just binged the hell out of it, and from that point on, I was a week-to-week guy. I fell in, and I fell in hard. But just kind of just prefacing my commentary with that little piece, so people have a little bit of an understanding of maybe where my comments come from.
Perfect. No, that's great. I think that helps with the diversity of what we're talking about here, because if you only throw people who read the books and live and breathe the books, then you're going to get one side, and there's multiple sides to this. There's something I've noticed in the idea of just a lot of competition for who's right or who's wrong. And I personally don't think that there's any one right answer here. Obviously, millions of dollars were put into this. Just the concept of, you got a book series. And we talked a little bit about the intro here, but we have a book series by George Martin. There's 5 books written. At the end of the 5th book, and Jerry, I'm sure you're aware, but at the end of the 5th book, we find out that the Night's Watch kills Jon Snow. And we also referenced the Red Wedding. There were other precedents that Martin set throughout the book series where major characters were killed off, and you had to accept that. You just had to accept that Game of Thrones, your favorite characters might die. And when Jon got stabbed and that was left as a cliffhanger, I think as years permeated and time went on, people realized John probably isn't dead, but, you know, there was a lot of time to think. And so you always have that thing hanging over your head saying maybe he is. And so show watchers and book watchers got to find out together, which was pretty interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit about the backstory where Frank was mentioning Dan and Dave, the two writers and directors of some of the episodes, but they basically they call themselves the showrunners. And Dan and Dave are taking a lot of heat right now. I believe that some of this heat is justified, and I will explain why, and then I want to talk a little bit about that because this goes into the acceptance. The reason I believe that the heat is justified is because these guys had a franchise that was unlike any franchise ever before, in that this was a pretty controversial topic. The story of Game of Thrones isn't something you just can talk openly about in the by the water cooler, because it deals with lots of nudity, lots of sex, lots of murder, lots of incest, sorts of things that just aren't generally common conversation. And that was part of the makeup of the overall story. However, the story itself was revolving around the politics, which is, as you know today, something that people are openly talking about. Now, you have a baseline, and we can point the fingers and blame George Martin a lot for the fact that he didn't complete the books and give them source material past what was already there at the time they decided to take on the show. But a writer and a director have two different jobs completely, and they kind of knew getting into it. HBO kind of knew getting into it that George Martin did not write books very fast. So a lot of fans, the first thing Jeremy, my brother, ever told me was, this isn't finished yet. You're going to drive yourself nuts if you read this, but you got to read it. Because he was sitting there at the end of book 5, or at the time book 4, waiting for book 5 for a long time. So they knew what they were getting into with George Martin, and they had to have known that there was a chance that he could die or not finish the books. So they met with him. They had a couple of meetings where they did multi-day sessions of talking about the notes. And they kind of left it at that, from what I understand. Obviously, we don't know the full story. But the story we got was that D&D is their nicknames, that they talked with George Martin about some key points and key plot lines along the way. And as they went into the season 5, 6, 7, and 8, they were loosely tied to the story that George Martin had created. This was on their shoulders. This was their baby. And as Frank said, it's no longer canon at that point. It's now a different entity. It's the same realm. It's the same players, but we got someone else writing the story and having the privilege of changing that story. These guys were winning awards, the groundbreaking number of awards every year at the award shows. Game of Thrones has got more viewers and ratings. These guys have the power to do whatever they want. And George Martin is now in the back seat, which probably is a position he's not used to being in with his characters and his story. Who knows? Maybe there was some politics behind the scenes where they had a little argument or whatever. Maybe not. Maybe everything is as it was supposed to be, as Bram would say. But the acceptance part comes along with fans who have just been waiting so damn long for anything, any type of conclusion or answers to some of the things. Because, let's face it, we all understand this is fantasy. So at the end of the day, how long can you dwell on a fantasy novel coming from one guy's brain? It could be anybody's brain, but it's this guy's brain. And we all know he's older, he's slow, and come on, just give us the story. So now we have the acceptance of, we know what's generally going to happen. If you read the books, you're just going to get a better detail. You might get different answers for some of these characters, and you might get a further storyline for some of the things that you were missing. But in general, we already kind of formulated what we wanted in our heads. We didn't necessarily get that with the show. And so there's people who are unhappy with the story, unhappy with the choices, unhappy with the plot points, unhappy with the pacing, or just happy or satisfied that it's over. Bless you. And so we have all sorts of different angles. It's not just any one. There are people who are pissing and moaning and probably don't have a right to. And then you have people who just wanted more. But the nitty gritty is that D&D signed a deal with Disney to do the next 3 Star Wars films, or a series of 3 Star Wars films. I don't know exactly the details. And so when the show went from this awesome amount of content, and every episode, I mean, there were very few episodes that felt like filler or, annoying to watch. They were all very well done, very well directed. Every single one was like a movie. And all of a sudden, they all started feeling a little bit slimmer to me. A little bit slimmer. It was like, oh, okay, well, I can accept that. Arya's here, now she's there, fine. I know that would take a half a year to make that journey, but, George has to do something in his books. These guys you can't have her on a boat the whole time or whatever. But then you started getting the fade to blacks and the lack of explanation and the lack of dialogue. Tyrion went from one of the best characters in the entire show and the books to being hardly referenced at all, hardly talking, not as fun to watch, and dialogue was just kind of stripped. And so now you have the writers who have all the reins, and they're making these decisions to just get to the end goal. The end goal, what's the end goal? Well, Jon kills Dany. And you say, okay, well, how do we get there? And there's a great picture on the internet of like a maze puzzle, and you see that they're trying to get through this maze puzzle, and then it's like season 8, a line straight to the center, right over the walls. And that's kind of what it felt like in a lot of ways. To do it justice, this is, in my opinion, one of the most amazing graphical, visual, cinematic shows ever. The actors, I don't think there's a single actor, aside from Bran, but he was playing the part he was asked to, where that didn't really perform in a way that I felt credible. And so I do believe that this acceptance is, if you want to accept it, but there's people who don't want to accept it. There's people who say, you know what, there was enough money, HBO wanted more, the fans wanted more. It's just these 2 guys, and they got away with being able to walk away and go to Star Wars rather than do the necessary amount of episodes to fulfill the story that they started 10 years ago. And so 2 people get to make that decision because of money and because of whatever personal feelings they had. And a lot of people have to walk away accepting, as opposed to people walking away saying, damn, that's monumental, beginning to end. Beginning to end, it was great. And now you have people scratching their heads going, well, it was really good. I mean, it was good acting. It was good this and that, but I just don't understand how these little things, how do we not see the response of Arya and Sansa finding out that their brother is the Targaryen, that, how do we not see the reaction of Tyrion finding out these things? Everything's just fade to black because they didn't have to. They knew. They just finished this story and move on. And that's where I personally get really disgruntled, saying they did have to satisfy us. They didn't have to if they didn't care. And so I know I've talked a lot here for a minute. I want to let either of you or both of you kind of talk that out. Jerry, not being a book reader, does any of that matter to you? And Frank, in your acceptance, does any of that play a part?
Well, as an individual who didn't read the book, the one thing that I knew coming in, just from the chatter, was the fact that there was this kind of contract that I had to make with myself, and understanding that the books were not done. And so I knew that as I watched this show, I'm going to go through a storyline that at some point the show is going to catch up and then very likely pass the books. And so I had to, again, make that contract with myself that at some point, if I like what I'm seeing to this point, it may change, and it very well did. Just like you saw the deal with the maze online, I saw another one that really kind of captured the essence of what happened. You see this beautiful pencil sketching of a horse, and it's just intricate details. It's all there. It's just very well done. And then as you get about 50-60% of the way through the horse, it turns into like the scribblings of a first grader. I'm not saying that D&D was like they were that horrible with it, but you saw the difference in what happened when they had all this beautiful work from Martin, just laid out there for them, to when they got to the part where they were just kind of given some notes and then basically creative license to get to the end. You saw how it kind of fell apart. It really kind of exposed D&D a bit, and maybe, they already had Star Wars on the brain. Maybe they were already checked out from all, they spent a decade on this thing already. They were just looking forward to the next thing. I think just a lot of these things showed in the end, and it really maybe did expose them a little bit. Maybe they were getting a little bit too much credit for the work that was really laid down, the foundation, brilliance that was given to them by George R. R. Martin. And at the end, what it became, I think, may show us a bit of a glimpse into what may be to come from these guys.
I think we have to go back and look. So book 5 is published in 2011, which is the first season of Game of Thrones. When you look at the best moments, like when you look back, now it's hard now because you have recency bias where, there was a dragon who torched King's Landing. That was really cool. But give it 6 months and you're going to look back and you're going to say, what are the best moments in this television show? What were the surprises? What was the action? What was the stuff that happened? And it's going to be Ned gets beheaded on episode 9. It's going to be the Red Wedding, the Purple Wedding. Jaime Lannister, the best swordsman in Westeros, gets his hand cut off. You go to episode 10 of season 1 where Dany goes into a funeral pyre, comes out with 3 dragons, right? You go to the episode where Renly gets killed by Mel's shadow baby. What do those all have in common? They're all books as source material. Dan and Dave are great showrunners, but when it came time for them to write their own material, you get nonsense, right? You get the Dothraki in a Pickett's charge into the dark, and they get destroyed, but then somehow show up enough that they can tear up King's Landing. You've got the Unsullied in front of your fortifications to fight the army of the dead, and yet somehow they're magically reproduced in order to stand on the steps of what's left of the Red Keep. I don't think that the material, if you go and talk to somebody and say, how's this going to end? Even if you're talking to George Martin, he's not going to give you everything, and I think they got some stuff. Like, okay, they get the big parts. They get, Arya defeats the Night King. Jon kills Dany. Jon has to go back up to the north. Arya leaves Westeros. Sansa declares a free and independent north. And then they have to figure out how to write that because they don't have this source material anymore.
Yeah, because those plot points you're talking about are phenomenal plot points. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
And they were surprises for the most. Like, if you hadn't read the books and you go into Joffrey's wedding, now Joffrey's going to marry the most beautiful girl in Westeros. He's going to bring gold and food back into the kingdom, and then he gets killed. I mean, so at the end of book 5, you had, this is where we are. Stannis is still with the Night's Watch. He hasn't killed his daughter. Arya's blind over in the House of Black and White. Jon is killed by the Night's Watch. Sansa's in the Eyrie. And Jaime and Brienne are together, and Jaime decides to leave Cersei with the Faith Militant. So from those periods forward, you have all creations by the showrunners, and it's just But
there were some seeds.
Example,
Let me just throw this out there, and I'll let you keep going here. But there's some seeds here that you skipped over, and probably not on purpose, but that were very important to book readers that maybe would have been confusing to show watchers, but I don't think so. And that is the aspect of Jon being able to warg into Ghost, and for Arya to have Nymeria and her army of the wolves, and also they dipped into Bran's ability to warg, but they didn't go so deep. They did here and there. But what I think was missing, and it started to be apparent, was those little pieces. And what I think in the final season here, I mean, let's face it, they cut Bran out of an entire season of Game of Thrones. For him to be the guy on the chair at the end, to me, was a little bit of foreshadowing in the fact that he was what's the term? He was forced to sit in a chair due to his situation. He was paralyzed. But they needed more. The stuff that we missed in season 8 that could have been there was more of the Bran backstory, more of Bran going back in time and seeing relevant events that may have, caused a different outcome, or given us a detail as to where the hell he was during the fight at Winterfell. And so those things right there, I think, were key elements that the book readers really wanted to know more. Like, where is Nymeria? What the hell? Where is this and that? So go ahead and continue what your idea was, but think about that a little bit in why there might be some aggression or anger as to.
No, I think you've nailed it. the point being that the showrunners really don't care about the fantasy aspect of this show. That their idea was, like you said, we need to get to the end. What do people like a lot on this show? It's the politics. It's the two people in a room having a discussion. But as book readers, the fact that the Starks are warging into their direwolves, the fact that when Dany walked into that funeral pyre, she brought magic back into the world with 3 dragons. The fact that, I mean, and for any book reader who, were around season 3 or so, and the Red Wedding happens, how many book readers said, "This is it. We're going to get some Lady Stoneheart. It's going to be great." I believe the showrunners held out the idea that Catelyn Stark could be revived from the dead because they needed to save that arrow in their quiver for when it was time to revive Jon Snow. If they'd have showed you that a lot of people can be revived at any time, it would have taken away from the idea that Jon Snow can be revived. Where,
yes,
and you just kind of see, you lose that magic throughout the series. Bran wargs into ravens all the time. He wargs into Hodor.
That's a precedent, though, that Martin sets on purpose, and by eliminating it in the show, it kind of, I don't know, Jerry, I'd like to hear your take on that. Like, when Jon came back to life, did you kind of know that was going to happen, or were you surprised?
I didn't count that out. The way that they kind of left you hanging on that for a bit. And again, I was one who, I wasn't afraid to go out and kind of read possible spoilers and that sort of thing. It was something that people, were definitely alluding to. So it didn't catch me by surprise. But, totally agree with Kevin's point that, if it was definitely an arrow that they kept in the quiver, because if they had kind of tipped their hat to these abilities or just, had pulled it off before Jon comes along, then it becomes something that's overdone. Then death doesn't really mean anything. It seems like anybody can be brought back at any point, so that the sense of loss might not be there. So
are you familiar with the Lady Stoneheart situation?
I did read a little bit into that, but again, without having a lot of the context around it, I tended to kind of just push that aside and try to stick purely with what I was seeing in the show. But again, I did run across some of that material.
And so for those who are not familiar with that, who are listening, the Lady Stoneheart is, as Frank was alluding to, Catelyn Stark. When she died at the Red Wedding, they tossed her body in the river. It floated downriver, and correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, I'm sure you probably know a little bit more detail than I do. Basically, the Brotherhood Without Banners found her body, and then it was Beric Dondarrion who gave the kiss of death, or the kiss of life,
right,
to sacrifice himself once and for all, bringing Catelyn Stark back into the world, but as an undead Catelyn Stark.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, Catelyn comes back as Lady Stoneheart, and she declares vengeance on anyone who supported the Lannisters or the Freys in the Riverlands. And her and the Brotherhood Without Banners turn from, almost the Robin Hood group of the Riverlands into an avenging angels sort of team, just going around killing Lannisters. And on top of that, I mean, the Riverlands is where a lot of stuff happens, and we just kind of cross over it so much. That's where Nymeria and the Wolfpack is. So between Nymeria and the Wolfpack and the Brotherhood Without Banners led by Lady Stoneheart, you have a lot of fantasy elements roaming around that, it was just yada-yada'd over,
Yep. And so I'm so interested, because that can't be a small chapter in the books to come. Lady Stoneheart is the last thing Brienne... I mean, from what I remember, like Frank said as well, Stannis isn't dead in the books. Brienne isn't at that battle. Brienne is about to be hung or whatever by Lady Stoneheart because she sees him with Jaime Lannister, and she doesn't quite understand that Jaime Lannister has kind of converted to a good guy at this point. And so the last thing we know is Brienne might be dying. Is that correct?
No, that's exactly right. And I think when they decided to make their edits to get characters, and I think a lot of it has to go with, and you brought up Bronn in your intro. Bronn became a fan favorite. In the books, he's a nobody. But because Jerome Flynn is such a fun actor, and he plays that role so well, he went from being a cutthroat who saves Tyrion up in the Eyrie to I'm going to be a Lannister's body man for the entire series, and that's great because I do love Bronn. Bronn is probably one of my favorite TV characters.
Now,
But-
I could have done without that one scene, or the way they handled that scene with Bronn showing up with the crossbow. I think if you take that scene out or adjust it, I feel like people weren't watching this whole thing as a whole, and they were like, okay, well, we got to get Bronn back into the mix, and how do we do that? And then later on, it's Bronn's just on the small council, and it's like, why would any of the people there trust to truly give Bronn Highgarden? Well, they could have reiterated one of the most classic phrases from Tyrion: a Lannister always pays his debts.
Right.
And they didn't say that, which doesn't remind the audience that Tyrion doesn't back down when he makes a promise. Tyrion is that guy. That's all they had to do. Tyrion said, Lannister pays his debts. Then that scene makes sense. Or you take that scene out, and then you just put Bronn in the small council and say, we gave him Highgarden, and that's the payment for all of his help along the way. And it's one or the other, but when you put it the way you did, you get a lot of people scratching their heads going like, why would you do that? It just doesn't make sense. Why would the Dothraki disappear and get eliminated? And now they're literally like a huge army. Like, why would you put those pieces the way you did? Somebody didn't sit down and watch all 6 episodes in succession, like before this thing aired, or they did and realized, well, there's really no change in it now. And I think that they had 2 years to do this. And I think that is part of that acceptance that some people just don't want to accept it because it's stupid. That the whole scene with Arya and the horse was a beautiful scene. It was amazingly shot. Arya looked devastated, and this horse comes out. Now, I got into it with some people online because they kept showing that little girl and clutching the horse throughout the episode. I never saw the horse, and my wife never saw the horse. We saw, and I hate to say it like this, I'm not the prettiest man in the world, but a rather interesting looking woman with a baby, and I was trying to figure out, are we supposed to know who that woman is? Is she important? She had very, very pronounced nose and ears, and a very pronounced face, and her hair was cut back. It made me feel like I'm supposed to be trying to figure her out or follow her. I never saw the horse, so at the end, when the girl is burned, and you see the horse's legs burned and charred at the end of episode 5. I didn't realize, I thought that was just her nub of an arm charred to the bone. And so I got, someone online was saying that was the horse, and I was like, I had to go back and look and be like, oh, I didn't even realize she was holding the damn horse. So the white horse at the end of that episode, not that, maybe I should have seen the horse, okay? So I'm not saying that because I didn't see it, everyone else should have. But you put that white horse at the end of that episode, you got to give it reason. You gave that horse 4 minutes of time. You got to give it more of a reason. And then not only to cut into episode 6, and Arya is in the same plaza that she was leaving from on that horse. So the continuity again. Now, obviously the timing is different. It's weeks later or days later or whatever, but she has to get out because the dragon fire is burning. And they just didn't really do that very well, where you go from these major moments. And that was the end of the episode. You're supposed to leave that episode with this feeling. And it seems like these directors weren't coordinating together. What do you guys think of that aspect of how, like, all these continuity between the different directors? Because the different directors direct every episode.
Well, Kevin, that's how it's done on every major show.
Jeremy, welcome to the show.
I've been listening to the whole podcast. I finally heard something I had to reply to.
Fair enough.
No, Jeremy sneaks in.
But that's how it's. But people. I think there's a lot of criticism going around about the way they produce this show, as if it's different than the way any other show is produced. That's a big budget show like this, and the nature of this particular show is bigger in scope in the production level than any other show on television. I mean, when you think about the production that goes into producing this, like, there is a reason why Star Wars movies don't get produced 6 to 10 times a year. There's a ton of effort and just man hours that goes into these things. And so, when you produce a show like this, you're going to need entirely different crews working on these shows because they're essentially producing short films. And you can't have the same editor and the same director and the same person, on set for every part of this show. It's just not even close to possible if you want Game of Thrones to take 2 years instead of 10. So people are criticizing certain aspects of this show when really it's fair to say you didn't like it, but to say that they should have done it differently because the production and the way it was produced, like as if they were inept, in other words. That's where I jump off, and that's where I leave the boat. I'm fine with saying I didn't
that's a fair
like
point.
The scene with the horse. You can say you didn't like the scene with the horse. That's fine. If you don't like the horse, you don't like the horse. I didn't particularly love the horse. The horse was, they went for some symbolism there, and I think it fell flat. I can freely admit that. What I won't do is say it's because they were careless and they didn't put the right amount of production value into the back end of this show.
Well, towards the beginning,
I feel like that kind of a claim is absurd.
I agree with you there, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, and we can get into more of that if you want. But the idea that this wasn't good, I don't think that is. I know that there's people out there saying that, but I don't think personally. I don't think it's a case of this wasn't good. I think what we're seeing here is the fact that these guys did sign on to Star Wars and did a rush job because they didn't want to do the 10 episodes HBO asked for. They didn't want to do extra seasons that George Martin said he had content for. And so they wanted to wrap it up. And they were the only ones that wanted to wrap this thing up. I mean, everyone else didn't. Some of these actors are like sad that it's over because they want to develop their characters further. And, they're making open comments about that stuff. So, and don't get me wrong.
Sure. So some of the actors are saying that, but Kevin, let's say that one actor, let's say Peter Dinklage is a very famous actor, and behind the scenes he's told them that he's only got a certain amount of time commitment that he wants to continue doing the show, and they know they need him for the ending of the show.
That's fair. There's politics that we will never know about. Yeah.
I think, and I've discussed this with people who've brought up the Star Wars issue, that Star Wars, Disney does not want to go into this new trilogy with these two showrunners and a controversy. They do not want. It's already started where Star Wars fans are probably Game of Thrones fans and the Song of Ice and Fire fans as well, and they're already nervous about it. I can't imagine that Disney would tell somebody who is still working under a not a Warner Brothers, but a Times Warner property, HBO, and say, hey, you guys need to hurry along if you want to get over here and work with us and get our money. I mean, I could see maybe they have senioritis, but as much work as they've put into this, like we said, I mean, you see actors on Game of Thrones who have started to do other stuff, who have wanted to do other stuff. It's hard to keep I'm sure Jeremy can probably talk more about it, but it's probably really hard to keep that many people, set designers and cameramen and grips and all the other stuff in Belfast for 10 years,
For sure. I definitely think that those are all probably more relevant than people's feelings online. And as you all are well aware, the barkers online are louder than the people who are content. The people who are content aren't going to be going online fighting over their contentness. So you're going to hear the barkers and it's going to seem like there's a lot more people unhappy. Frank
that's true.
Frank can vouch for me.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Frank can vouch for me in the other comment that you were making about like people being unhappy. I think I sent Frank and Lisa a message right after the Battle of Winterfell, because in real life, I was so conflicted. I loved everything that I saw. I was amazed at the story and everything, but there was just so much missing, and I could not figure it out. I couldn't figure out why I wasn't happy. It wasn't I hadn't gone on the internet or anything like that. At that point, I hadn't seen any spoilers. I was just like, why? Like, why are we here right now? And I personally just couldn't come to reason. I still to this day don't know what I think it just was lack of what we normally get out of Martin, and that is the story element. It was just like we had to get the Battle of Winterfell over with because we only have 6 episodes, rather than the Battle of Winterfell should take 2 episodes and we need 10 total. It seems
I think that's a really good point. And I think that if there's one thing that this whole thing does, this whole season has really done more than, it's in a way, it's a brilliant plot twist for real life storytelling, because I didn't think that there was a plot twist that could turn the public back in favor of George Martin. With the way that guy has refused to write the last 2 books and basically, like, you know, told anybody who said, hey, can we see those books? You know, basically said F you to anybody who asks him for them. I thought that there was no way for him to earn his street cred back. But I think that the one thing we learned progressively after they stopped having the source material is that, you know, these guys, they didn't do anything different over the last few seasons in my mind. The only difference is that they didn't have George R.R. Martin's direct source material to just take scenes from, word for word, beat for beat. You know, that's why the pacing of the show is so different. You've got 2 guys who are not even 2 guys. There's a whole bunch of people writing on that show. You got a bunch of people writing who are television writers, and they don't have Martin's source material to lean on for the biggest scenes. And
this is
progressively became more like a regular television show.
Yep.
This is a good segue to a topic I want to talk about. But Frank, go ahead with your point before I jump into.
No, I was just going to say with Jeremy that, you know, I was speaking with a friend of mine. We both read the books. We both watched the show, and you know, the idea for the longest time was, oh, these guys are going to finish George's story. I wonder how he feels. And for a while there, the chatter was, oh, they're going to do a better job because we believed, or viewers believed, that they were putting on this great show. And then, as Jeremy said, once they ran out of George's source material, yeah, it became a TV show. You had TV writers instead of a guy who is well versed in his material, who knows his material. You know, and it's harder to get into the mind of someone who can talk about the politics of Westeros.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, he stops and writes history books to create the content of his main books, which is crazy. Not many writers do that.
I mean, what we're finding out here is that, you know, and I think that it's really no exaggeration to say that, you know, George R.R. Martin has probably written the most popular single piece of fiction of his generation.
Yep.
I mean, he is, especially if you're going to talk fantasy, I mean, he is, you know, the next thing to J.R.R. Tolkien, and you can't undersell that, you know. I mean, the importance of his incredible ability to write dialogue and to make it, you know, everybody's talking about how come this scene doesn't breathe, and how come this doesn't breathe, and how come we don't have time to capture the nuance of this? Well, it's because you went from having maybe the greatest fantasy writer of his generation penning this stuff to people who write TV shows. And I challenge the people who think that it's written badly for a TV show, I challenge them to watch other TV shows. Mm-hmm. This show is not written badly. You know, I mean, especially for historical fantasy. I challenge anybody to go watch a couple episodes of A Sword of Truth or...
that was awesome. You know, that was really well done.
Mean, oh my God. Any of these shows, go find any television show based on a fantasy series and watch it, and then come back and tell me that the writing on Game of Thrones is bad for television.
Well, no, but if you go back 10 years before Game of Thrones happened, and they were doing fantasy movies and stuff, and you know, we took what we got, and then we got Game of Thrones, it's changed all of our minds as to what's possible.
It spoiled everybody. Yeah, the writing that you saw these last few seasons, it's not bad for television. It's just bad compared to George Martin.
I've been saying that a long time, yeah.
That's the thing. Now,
going into your point about, we were talking a little bit prior, I think one of the things that this season was lacking, I think a lot of people would say they would prefer more. We don't know the politics behind, we don't know for sure the politics behind, we can hear rumors or whatnot. But let's say it had 10 episodes. I feel like a lot of that content could have been a little bit more of building Bran and giving him some dialogue or some better situational awareness or whatever. I mean, if you really look at it as a show watcher only, and Jerry, this is something for you to think about. Jeremy, you haven't heard Jerry talk yet, but we have another guy on as well, Jerry, who basically, when you look at all the stuff that they did with the Night King, and you look at all the stuff that you know in the books, George Martin's writing the inner dialogue of Bran, right? Bran has his own chapters, but in the show, he's just rolling his eyes in the back of his head and disappearing for an hour. So what I would have liked to see more of was that, of building Bran as a reason. Because when you look at what we have Bran disappearing and just popping up when it matters for plot. And that was where I think a lack of the writing, there wasn't any writing. I mean, having Bran just sit there, I'm going to go now. I was hoping for some epic speech by Bran. I was hoping for some epic moment where Bran stood up out of his chair and was like, I'm really not Bran, or whatever he had to do. But like a moment, Bran had no moments. There was nothing. He didn't warg into Drogon and stop, Daenerys from killing King's Landing. It would have been awesome if all of a sudden Drogon's flying straight for the Red Keep and just stops in his tracks and flies away. And you're like, where the hell did he go? And you find out that Bran did that or something. But no, we didn't get Bran doing anything powerful, anything major since Hodor. And so that was a huge lackluster thing. To me, if you're looking at what you get is they're all thinking Bran's the best person for the job. They all say yes. But as a viewer, Bran hasn't said more than 2 words. What do you think he's going to tell stories? He's not telling any stories. He's not telling anyone that the Night King is coming to Winterfell to kill him. So he brought them there. Like, if I were any of the people who died, I'd be a little pissed off about that situation, Like, oh, this was all because of this one kid? And we're to believe him that he knows everything? And so a little bit more of explanation on that. A lot more explanation of that. He was a central point character in the books.
100% agree with that. I think that's one of those nail on the head things there that I can't let go. Again, as a guy who was strictly just following the show, I mean, here's an individual who ends up playing this huge role in the end, but his story really was absent for so long. I mean, it's almost like in season 5 you hear like nothing of. He's I think one of the lowest paid of the actors. It just tells you how much he was missing from the show at about, I think for quite some time, about $10,000 per episode, where others were making $100,000 and then leading into these final episodes, some making $500,000 per episode. But he remained one of the lowest paying guys. And I mean, you're just, where do you even start with Bran? I mean, this is a kid who, some time ago, I think there was some dialogue to the effect that, why can't Bran, lead in Winterfell, and he's like, well, I can't lead Winterfell, I can't lead anything, I'm the three-eyed raven. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, Bran, want to be king? And he's like, yeah, that sounds great. So there's just a lot. There's a lot missing there. And then of course in the very end, he's sitting there and he gives them that line, why do you think I came all this way? And it almost makes you think, well, hell, this guy might just be the most evil of all of them. He knew all of this was going to happen. He foresaw all of this. He let King's Landing get burned to the ground, the men, the women, the children. That would make him the most evil of all the characters, because this was all to him just a means to an end. This was about him getting to the throne. So I don't know. I'll let you guys chew on that a little bit, but yeah, that's kind of where my head is.
Well, I think you bring up a great point. We don't know what Bran's powers are as the three-eyed raven. We see him go into his trance or whatever, and he wargs into ravens, or supposedly he has all the history of Westeros, but it's never been explained what the three-eyed raven's job was, and then, like you said, why do you think I came all the way down here? Did he already know that was going to be a thing, that they were going to offer him? Because sitting on that dais, you have Gendry, who has a claim to the throne through Robert Baratheon. Sitting in the cell somewhere, you have the lawful potential ruler of Westeros in Jon Snow.
Why didn't they just defer to Jon and say, what do you think we should do? Do you want to do it or not? You're the rightful king.
Right. Well, that's the one thing I will point out. I mean, if I was a writer of the show, I would say, and by the way, I agree with everything everybody's saying about Bran, but plot-wise. But I would say the one thing is that how many times do we have to have Jon Snow look directly into the camera and yell, I don't want it? I mean, he said it like 30 times this season. So of all the characters, that's the one that I'll give them a pass on.
Okay, but how about if you don't want it, who should have it? Bran should have it. Done.
Kit
Done.
Harington stole money this year because he had 5 lines. He had the Night King. I've seen him. I've looked into his eyes. Winter is coming. He had, he didn't really have. We knew what he was going to say. You're my queen.
Yep. He did have a hell of a speech though. In what was it, episode 2 or no, episode 4?
He stole Meister Aemon's speech.
That's true. That is true. But that was a very impactful.
But we
moment.
don't even know. Like, Kit Harington is one of those guys who's currently in demand for other projects. Do we even know that Kit Harington isn't one of the guys who told them that he could only be available for a certain amount of time, and that's why the shooting over these last 2 years, like maybe he wasn't even available.
He alluded to in interviews that he expected more. And,
look, they're all going to say the right thing.
They're saying the wrong thing for politics wise. They're saying they're all basically saying
no. He's saying the right thing for his career. I'm not even saying I know anything. I'm just saying, for instance, like we don't usually find out about this stuff till later on because it's just not good back Hollywood politics to let this stuff out. But like, if let's say Kit Harington was kind of a pain in the ass behind the scenes, right? Yeah. Does it help him in his career to go out in public and say, yeah, blame me, I was a pain in the ass? No, he's going to go out in public and he's going to say, oh, yeah, I really missed the show. I see the fan reaction and I wish I could have done more. By the way, go see my next movie, Pompeii 2.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
This time we get it right.
Well, there was a good interview. There was a good interview with there was a couple of interviews, but obviously the memes going around where you have like Daenerys or Emilia Clarke going, oh yeah, best season ever, and making a face. And then you have one with Grey Worm and the actor behind Gendry, and they were talking, and I forget exactly what Gendry says, but he says something, and then Grey Worm is like, yeah, you're not getting a role on Star Wars, and they kind of laugh it off. But they are taking those pot shots, and they're saying like, yeah, there was no character development after season 6, and there was no, no sticking to the story. And I don't think that the story of Daenerys being the evil villain at the very end was wrong, and I think that Emilia Clarke absolutely killed it. By the time she was standing up on that, on the steps of the castle, I was getting goosebumps because she played that part to a T. And you could say it's cheesy, or you could say it was the most amazing shot when she comes walking up and Drogon's behind her. That was phenomenally shot. Cinematography was unbelievable, and it was like, you could feel the tension in Jon and Tyrion. Their acting was 10 out of 10 at that moment. They played what they needed to play right there. And Daenerys, you could see it in her eyes of like taking it all in. I couldn't have asked for better acting and better representation of what they were being asked to do. How they got there, maybe I could ask for, I could say I wish it was different. Mm-hmm. And at the end, even through all of the pains and problems I personally have with the pacing, it's still better than any pacing in any TV show I've ever seen. So I do feel a bit disgruntled that I didn't get exactly what I wanted out of the story. But Frank was saying a little while ago that at the end of the day, 5 years from now, you're going to think back. What are you going to remember? You're going to remember some of those key plot points. And those were the key plot points given to us by George Martin.